Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. It's time, once again, for another depressing dose of dismal Disney. Way back on May 26th of this year, Disney released a new race-swapped live-action remake of one of their classic animated movies, The Little Mermaid, starring Halle Bailey playing the role of Ariel minus the red hair. And while there were Thursday night previews to add to the movie's domestic opening weekend box office, as well as a domestic national holiday, the movie ultimately failed to break even. And apparently, Disney wasn't honest about the movie's actual production budget, so I don't believe that anyone should be surprised by that. This being another post-mortem video, we'll begin with the movie's domestic opening weekend box office. The Little Mermaid earned $95.6 million for its domestic opening weekend box office, and it earned slightly more than that overseas with an international opening weekend of around $98.5 million. So on the surface, these numbers may not sound bad because, combined, that was a global gross opening weekend box office of $194.1 million. And the movie also briefly had a domestic share of 49.25%, which wasn't awful, but it immediately changed the following day thanks to the Monday Memorial Day holiday, and not in a good direction. For the movie's second weekend at the box office, which followed the Monday Memorial Day holiday in the US, the movie's domestic box office earnings dropped to $41.4 million. But thanks to Memorial Day, the movie had earned $43 million domestically over the course of the week. This means that the movie's domestic earnings by the end of its second weekend at the box office had increased by $84.4 million, which was only an 11.7% weekly drop from its total opening weekend earnings. So at the end of its second weekend at the box office, the movie's domestic earnings had risen to $187 million. And again, while this may not sound bad on the surface, the movie's international earnings by the end of that same weekend had only risen by $42 million, which was a weekly drop of 57.36% for an international second weekend box office total of around $140.5 million. So at that time, the movie's global gross box office earnings had reached $327.5 million, but its domestic share had shot upwards to 57%. And over the course of the movie's next 14 weeks at the box office, its domestic share only fell to around 52.35%, which means that the movie's final domestic box office earnings were higher than its final international box office. And for studios, that's typically not a good thing. This chart illustrates the movie's weekly domestic and international box office earnings over the course of its theatrical run. The bump in the weekly domestic box office during its second weekend, as illustrated by the blue line in the chart, was due to the US Memorial Day holiday. And as the chart shows, the weekly international box office only experienced a small bump during the movie's third weekend in theaters, which only brought it back to around the same level as the weekly domestic box office from that point forward. And from that point onwards, the weekly domestic and international box office earnings were roughly the same. But to see where the cumulative domestic, international, and global box office totals for the movie ended up, we'll look at this next chart, which also includes the domestic share as shown by the green line. The final domestic box office earnings for The Little Mermaid was $298.2 million. But its final international box office was slightly lower at $271.4 million, and its final global gross box office was $569.6 million. And we'll remember that number because it's going to pop up again in this video. So how close was my earliest final global gross box office projection for the movie to its actual final result? I had released my very first final global gross box office projection for The Little Mermaid in a video that I had released way back on May 24th, which was only 2 days before the movie had opened in theaters. And that very first projection was not based on any actual earnings, which had not yet begun. Instead, they were based on the following criteria. Since many recent movies that have featured a lot of black actors in leading roles have not performed well in overseas movie markets, especially in China, I made an educated guess that the final domestic share for The Little Mermaid was likely going to be greater than 50%. In fact, the most recent Disney movie that was released before The Little Mermaid that had a mostly black cast was 2022's MCU movie, Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, and that movie's final domestic share was 53.1%. So my very first assumption was that The Little Mermaid would likely end up with a domestic share of around 53.1%. Next, various media sources at the time were projecting that the movie's domestic opening weekend box office would probably be around $110 million, which I suspect was including the Monday Memorial Day holiday. So I used that reported projected opening weekend box office in my own projections for the movie. Finally, based on what I had observed for many movies in theaters, their average weekly drops in box office typically ranged between 30 to 40%, with the smaller of the two being the more ideal situation. So based on this criteria, my original projection for the movie's final global gross box office earnings was that it would probably fall somewhere in the range of $518 million to $688 million. And the midpoint for that range was $603 million. The movie's final global gross box office earnings of $569.6 million clearly fell well within my original projected range and was only $33.4 million below the midpoint of that original projected range. Further, the movie's final domestic share of 52.35% was only 0.75% lower than my original guess of 53.1%. And what about the average weekly drops in box office for the movie? How close were they to the range of 30 to 40% that I had assumed? The movie's domestic average weekly drop was 32.05%. Its international average weekly drop was 36.3%, and its global average weekly drop was 34.08%. So all of these were well within the range of 30 to 40% that I had originally assumed. Thus, not only were my original assumptions spot on, the movie performed nearly exactly to what I had originally believed. Now, given that I can project what a movie's final global gross box office earnings might be, I can also project what its profits or losses might be by knowing what the movie's production budget is and by making assumptions regarding the additional costs that studios pay for marketing and other miscellaneous costs that are above and beyond the production budget. And given that movie theaters typically keep at least 50% of the global gross box office ticket sales for themselves, the most money that a studio can get from the ticket sales is not more than 50%. The original production budget that Disney had reported for The Little Mermaid was $250 million. But guess what? They lied. Just as Warner Bros. Discovery had lied about the actual production budget for The Flash, as I had reported in a video that I had released back on August 22nd, it turns out that Disney had done something similar because Forbes reported on October 2nd that Disney's production budget for The Little Mermaid was actually around $300 million. And that's $50 million more than what they had originally reported. So yeah, Disney lied, and I won't be surprised if they may have also lied about their reported marketing budget for the movie of $140 million. Studios don't typically report what a movie's other costs are beyond the production budget, such as marketing. So having an actual number for the marketing budget is unusual, but makes it easier to know what the movie's estimated break-even point is. And in the case of The Little Mermaid, we begin to estimate its break-even point by adding its $300 million production budget and its $140 million marketing budget together to calculate a total cost of $440 million. We then multiply that total cost by 2 to account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves to know what that estimated break-even point is in terms of earned global gross box office revenue. So the estimated break-even point for The Little Mermaid works out to around $880 million, and that's a huge number that the movie was simply never going to achieve. Since the movie only earned $569.6 million in global gross box office revenue, it needed to earn another $310.5 million just to break even. In other words, the movie only earned 64.7% of what it needed to break even, which wasn't even 2/3 of what it needed. And because it was $310.5 million shy of breaking even, when we divide that number by 2 to account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, this means that Disney lost around $155.2 million on the movie. This makes The Little Mermaid one of the biggest flops for 2023, but not enough to be the actual biggest flop, as I have talked about in my Who Will Be the Biggest Flop video series. And that $155.2 million loss is $50 million higher than what Disney actually wanted people to know, especially its disgruntled shareholders. That's why they lied about that $300 million production budget. Since the beginning of the year, the highest value that Disney stock had was $113.21 per share, and that was back on February 2nd. Today, it closed at around $84.99 per share as of the time that I'm recording this video, but it had closed as low as $79.32 a share back on October 4th, which was last Wednesday. And back when this movie had opened at the end of May, Disney stock on May 30th had closed at $87.82 per share, which was the low point of a series of drops that had occurred over the preceding days. Shareholders have clearly lost confidence in Disney, and movies like The Little Mermaid, that cost $300 million to produce, $140 million to advertise, and ended up losing $155 million for the studio, is only part of the reason why its stock value is so bad right now. So let's ask the question, could The Little Mermaid have broken even? Obviously, the only way that this movie could have broken even would have been with significantly lower production and marketing budgets. Given that the movie only earned $569.6 million, if that had been its break-even point, then its combined production and marketing budgets would have to have been no more than $284.8 million. And given that the production budget of $300 million represents 68.2% of the movie's combined $440 million production and marketing budget cost, 68.2% of $284.8 million would have been $194.2 million. So at a minimum, Disney overspent $105.8 million producing The Little Mermaid, and they also overspent $49.4 million on marketing. Otherwise, with a break-even point of $880 million, the only way that the movie could have broken even with a global average weekly drop of 34.08% would be if the movie had earned a global gross opening weekend box office of at least $299.9 million, which would have been $105.8 million more than its actual global gross opening weekend box office of $194.1 million. So right out of the gate, this movie didn't have a snowball's chance in hell of breaking even. And this is why Disney so desperately had Halle Bailey and Melissa McCarthy appear on the Academy Awards back in March to try and shill the movie when it appeared that they were going to be presenting an award, as I had talked about in a video that I had released back on March 15th. Disney and its former DEI boss had clearly convinced themselves that a race-swapped live-action remake of The Little Mermaid was going to be a huge box office hit when they greenlit the movie. But moviegoers weren't interested for a variety of reasons, especially overseas where the movie bombed more than it did domestically. Thus, The Little Mermaid has become one more example of the saying, go woke, go broke. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.